there's a specific gap worth addressing directly, one this entire series has largely left unexplored despite dozens of previous conversations focused extensively on the psychological and emotional dimensions of healing. Today, we're tracing 7 considerably more practical, tangible areas of recovery, the concrete daily life domains that genuine, comprehensive healing after a toxic relationship actually requires attending to, alongside everything we've traced regarding internal psychological work. Area 1: your physical health and sleep, often significantly disrupted throughout the relationship's duration. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the chronic stress and hypervigilance that characterizes life inside a toxic relationship, the constant monitoring, the sustained cortisol exposure this produces throughout the nervous system. This chronic activation often produces measurable physical consequences that persist well beyond the relationship's ending: disrupted sleep patterns, digestive issues, chronic tension, sometimes broader immune system impact from sustained stress exposure. Recovery here requires deliberate attention to rebuilding basic physical regulation, consistent sleep schedules, gentle movement, nutrition that supports rather than further stresses an already taxed system. Area 2: your financial stability, particularly if the relationship involved economic control or economic entanglement. This connects to something we touched on briefly throughout our conversation about the hidden marriage trap, but deserves considerably fuller examination here. Many toxic relationships involve genuine financial harm, controlled access to money, accumulated debt taken on for his benefit, career opportunities sacrificed to accommodate the relationship's demands. Recovery here often requires practical, unglamorous work, understanding your actual financial position clearly, rebuilding credit if it was damaged, developing genuine financial literacy if this was another area where control was exercised throughout the relationship. Area 3: your social circle, often significantly diminished through the isolation many toxic relationships produce. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissistic strategy often specifically targets outside relationships, gradually creating distance between you and people who might otherwise provide perspective or support. Recovery here means deliberately, patiently rebuilding these connections, reaching back out to friendships that faded, joining new communities, gradually reconstructing a social foundation that toxic isolation specifically worked to erode. Area 4: your professional life and career trajectory, sometimes significantly impacted by the relationship's demands. This connects to genuine, practical consequences many people experience but rarely discuss directly: missed opportunities, reduced performance during periods of significant relationship stress, sometimes outright sabotage of professional pursuits that threaten to increase your independence. Recovery here means honest assessment of where your career currently stands, followed by deliberate, patient rebuilding of exactly the professional momentum that toxic dynamics may have specifically worked to suppress. Area 5: your physical living space and daily environment. Remember something worth naming directly, that this entire series hasn't yet fully addressed. Physical spaces often carry genuine emotional weight, particularly spaces where significant harm occurred. Recovery here sometimes means deliberately reorganizing, redecorating, or even relocating from spaces too closely associated with the relationship's difficulty, creating physical environment that supports rather than continuously reactivates the healing process underway internally. Area 6: your daily routines and sense of personal structure, often significantly disrupted by the relationship's chaos or control. This addresses something practical worth understanding directly. Toxic relationships often disrupt ordinary daily structure, either through chaos requiring constant reactive management, or through his control over how your time gets spent. Recovery here means deliberately rebuilding routines that reflect your own genuine preferences and genuine priorities, rather than routines shaped around managing or accommodating someone else's needs. Area 7: your capacity for genuine pleasure and genuine joy, often diminished through sustained stress and sustained emotional suppression. Recovery here means deliberately, patiently reintroducing activities and experiences that produce genuine enjoyment, independent of any practical purpose, rebuilding the capacity for lightness and pleasure that sustained difficulty often significantly diminishes. Let's examine each of these 7 practical areas more closely, tracing specific, actionable approaches for each one, because understanding what needs attention matters considerably less than understanding how to actually address it in practical, sustainable ways. Here's what's worth understanding about rebuilding physical health and sleep, connecting to the specific mechanism through which chronic stress produces lasting physiological consequence. Recovery here often benefits from working with a physician who understands trauma's physical impact, particularly if sleep disruption or digestive issues have persisted for extended periods. Beyond professional support, small, consistent practices matter considerably more than dramatic overhauls. A consistent bedtime, gentle daily movement even when motivation feels low, reducing caffeine or alcohol, if these have become coping mechanisms during the relationship's most difficult periods. This area often improves gradually rather than quickly, requiring the same patience this entire series has traced regarding psychological healing. Here's what's worth understanding about rebuilding financial stability, connecting to something worth naming directly. This area often produces genuine shame that deserves acknowledgement rather than suppression. If financial control or financial harm occurred throughout the relationship, recovery doesn't require you to have everything figured out immediately. It means taking the first, concrete steps, reviewing actual account statements and actual debt honestly, even when this feels uncomfortable, consulting with a financial advisor or credit counselor if the situation feels genuinely overwhelming to navigate alone, setting small, achievable goals rather than expecting complete financial recovery within any particular time frame. Here's what's worth understanding about rebuilding your social circle, connecting to something we've traced throughout this entire series about how isolation specifically served the relationship's continuation. Recovery here often requires accepting genuine discomfort in the early stages. Reaching out to people you haven't spoken with in considerable time can feel awkward, even embarrassing, particularly if pride or shame makes acknowledging the relationship's difficulty feel exposing. Starting small matters considerably here, one reconnected friendship, one new activity or community, rather than expecting your entire previous social world to instantly restore itself. Here's what's worth understanding about rebuilding your professional trajectory, connecting to something worth naming honestly. This area sometimes requires accepting that certain opportunities genuinely were lost and cannot be fully reclaimed, while still recognizing that considerable runway typically remains for continued growth. Recovery here means honest assessment without excessive self-blame, recognizing what circumstances genuinely limited your professional development during the relationship, while focusing forward energy on concrete, achievable next steps rather than dwelling exclusively on what was lost. Here's what's worth understanding about your physical living space, connecting to something genuinely practical worth considering directly. If your current living space carries significant negative association with the relationship, even small changes can produce meaningful psychological relief. Rearranging furniture, removing or replacing items specifically associated with difficult memories, if possible even relocating entirely if circumstances allow this and if the current space genuinely continues reactivating distress rather than supporting recovery. Here's what's worth understanding about rebuilding daily routines, connecting to something we've traced throughout this entire series about reclaiming your own preferences after sustained accommodation of someone else's needs. Recovery here often benefits from genuine experimentation, trying different daily structures, different morning and evening rituals, paying attention to which specific routines genuinely feel supportive versus which ones you're simply defaulting to out of habit, gradually constructing a daily rhythm that authentically reflects your own genuine preferences. Here's what's worth understanding about rebuilding capacity for genuine pleasures, connecting to something worth understanding as genuinely important rather than frivolous or secondary to the more serious psychological work this entire series has traced extensively. Sustained stress and sustained emotional suppression genuinely diminish the brain's capacity for pleasure and enjoyment, a phenomenon well documented in trauma research. Recovery here means deliberately, patiently reintroducing activities purely for their own enjoyment. Creative pursuits, physical activities, social experiences chosen specifically because they sound genuinely appealing rather than because they serve any particular productive purpose. Here's something crucial worth understanding about how these 7 practical areas relate to the psychological work this entire series has traced extensively throughout dozens of previous conversations. These areas don't exist separately from internal healing. They interact with and support it considerably. Improved sleep supports emotional regulation. Rebuilt social connection supports self-worth. Restored capacity for pleasure supports genuine hope for the future. Understanding these practical areas as genuinely interconnected with the psychological work this series has traced extensively, rather than as separate secondary concerns, matters considerably for approaching your recovery comprehensively rather than focusing exclusively on internal work while neglecting the practical, tangible foundations that support it. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward. And it's worth being direct about it rather than leaving this conversation as simply a practical checklist without addressing what genuinely matters most, how to actually approach these 7 areas without becoming overwhelmed by their combined scope, and how to hold realistic expectations about the genuine, gradual pace at which practical recovery typically unfolds. The first thing worth understanding clearly is something worth naming directly, connecting to a real risk this comprehensive list might otherwise create. 7 distinct areas requiring attention can feel genuinely overwhelming, particularly for someone already exhausted from the psychological work this entire series has traced extensively throughout dozens of previous conversations. Remember everything we've established throughout this entire series about the danger of treating healing as a checklist requiring simultaneous progress across every dimension. You don't need to address all 7 of these practical areas at once, and attempting to do so often produces exactly the overwhelm that prevents genuine, sustainable progress in any single area. Here's the second thing worth understanding, one that offers a considerably more sustainable approach to this entire framework. Consider identifying which 1 or 2 areas currently feel most urgent or most impactful to your daily functioning, and beginning there specifically, rather than attempting comprehensive progress across all 7 simultaneously. If sleep disruption is significantly affecting your daily capacity to function, this might deserve priority attention before financial recovery, which might itself deserve priority before rebuilding your social circle. There's no universally correct sequence. The right starting point depends entirely on your own specific circumstances and your own specific sense of which area currently produces the most significant daily impact. Here's the third thing worth understanding, one that connects to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series in countless different forms. Professional support often proves genuinely valuable across several of these practical areas, not simply for the psychological work this entire series has traced extensively. Financial advisors, career counselors, physicians familiar with trauma's physical impact, even simply trusted friends who can offer practical help with specific tasks. These forms of support don't represent failure to handle recovery independently. They represent genuine, sensible use of available resources for practical challenges that often benefit considerably from expertise beyond what any single person, however capable, typically possesses across every one of these 7 distinct domains. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about timeline expectations across these 7 practical areas specifically. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about genuine change requiring sustained time rather than immediate transformation. Financial recovery, in particular, often requires years rather than months, particularly if significant debt or significant credit damage occurred throughout the relationship. Professional trajectory rebuilding similarly often requires patient, sustained effort over considerable time. Understanding these realistic timelines in advance protects you from unnecessary discouragement when progress in these particular areas moves more slowly than the psychological healing this series has traced might suggest is possible. Here's the fifth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this entire conversation. These 7 practical areas, physical health, financial stability, social connection, professional trajectory, living environment, daily routine, and capacity for pleasure, represent the tangible, lived experience foundation that supports and reflects everything this entire series has traced regarding your internal, psychological healing. Progress in these practical domains isn't separate from your genuine, comprehensive recovery. It's an essential, equally valid dimension of it, deserving the same patience, the same self-compassion, and the same sustained attention you've likely already been extending toward the deeper psychological work this entire series has examined so extensively across dozens of previous conversations. You don't need every one of these 7 areas fully restored before considering your recovery genuine or complete. You simply need to continue, patiently and consistently, addressing whichever areas currently matter most, trusting that progress in one will gradually support progress in the others, exactly as we've traced throughout this entire conversation. Your sleep will gradually stabilize, your finances will gradually rebuild, your social world will gradually expand again, your capacity for genuine pleasure will gradually return. None of this happens instantly, and none of it needs to happen in any particular order. It simply needs to continue happening, gradually and genuinely, alongside the deeper psychological healing this entire series has traced so thoroughly, until one day, considerable time from now, you'll notice that both dimensions of your recovery, internal and practical, have quietly, genuinely, comprehensively transformed into the full, complete, thriving life you deserve and are entirely capable of building. There's one final consideration worth adding here, because it addresses something practical worth carrying forwards. How do you actually know when progress in these 7 areas is genuinely occurring, particularly when practical recovery, unlike some psychological milestones, doesn't always announce itself through clear, identifiable moments of realization? This deserves honest examination, because practical recovery often unfolds so gradually that people frequently fail to notice how far they've actually come until they deliberately pause to reflect. Here's a practical suggestion worth considering directly periodically. Perhaps every few months, take honest stock of each of these 7 areas specifically, comparing your current state against where you stood at the relationship's actual ending, rather than against some idealized, fully recovered future state. This comparison against your own past, rather than against an imagined finish line, typically reveals considerably more genuine progress than moment-to-moment awareness alone tends to capture, precisely because gradual change becomes genuinely difficult to perceive without this kind of deliberate, periodic comparison. Here's something worth understanding about a specific pattern worth watching for as genuine confirmation that practical recovery is authentically underway. It's increasing capacity to make decisions and take action in these 7 areas without requiring the same level of deliberate, exhausting effort each step once demanded. Early recovery often requires genuine, conscious effort for even small practical tasks. Forcing yourself to reach out to a friend, forcing yourself to review a bank statement you've been avoiding. Genuine progress typically manifests as these same actions gradually requiring less conscious effort, becoming increasingly natural rather than remaining perpetually effortful. Here's a final thought worth carrying forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation. The 7 practical areas we've examined today: physical health, financial stability, social connection, professional trajectory, living environment, daily routine, and capacity for pleasure, represent the visible, tangible evidence of the deeper transformation this entire series has traced across dozens of previous conversations. When someone eventually looks at your life from the outside, these are often the dimensions they'll notice first: better sleep reflected in your energy, rebuilt friendships reflected in your social presence, restored capacity for joy reflected in your genuine laughter and genuine engagement with life again. This is ultimately why these practical areas deserve the same genuine attention and genuine patience as the psychological work this entire series has traced so extensively. They're not separate from your healing. They're its visible expression, the tangible proof that everything happening internally is genuinely, comprehensively translating into the fuller, freer, more genuinely alive life you deserve after everything you've survived. Continue tending to both dimensions together, the internal work and these 7 practical foundations, trusting that each one strengthens the other until the life you're rebuilding, in every visible and invisible sense, genuinely, completely belongs to you again.